This is a prayer that was sent to me by a sister of St. Joseph in Albany, New York, and it's called a prayer for the tired, angry ones. Okay. God, we are so tired. We want to do justice, but the work feels endless, and the results look so small in our exhausted hands.
We want to love mercy, but our enemies are relentless, and it feels like foolishness to prioritize gentleness in this unbelievably cruel world.
We want to walk humbly, but self-promotion is seductive. And we are afraid that if we don't look after ourselves, no one else will.
We want to be kind, but our anger feels insatiable. In this never-ending wilderness, come to us and grant us grace.
Grant us the courage to keep showing up to impossible battles, trusting it is our commitment to faithfulness and not our obsession with results that will bring in your peace.
Grant us the vulnerability to risk loving our difficult and complicated neighbor, rejecting the lie that some people are made more in your image than others.
Grant us the humility to be a de-centered but beloved self as we continue to take the single step that is in front of us to keep us from becoming what we are called to transform.
Protect us from using the empire's violence in our words, in our theology, in our activism, and in our politics, for your kingdom of peace.
Keep our anger from becoming meanness. Keep our sorrow from collapsing into self-pity. Keep our hearts soft enough to keep breaking, and keep our outrage turned toward justice, not cruelty.
Remind us that all of this, every bit of it, is for love. Keep us fiercely kind, and let the people say, Amen.
Well, Jack, welcome back. Many of you remember he was here about a month ago, and we made a little hiccup last time. People were saying not everybody in the room knows Jack. I said, how's that possible? Everybody knows Jack. But no, seriously, we welcome you, Professor Emeritus from St. Thomas, Justice and Peace Program Department, former state legislature candidate. Federal candidate. So maybe share a little bit about yourself so people know things you've written, things you've done in the peace work, and then welcome to sharing with us, and we'll open up for conversation like we did last time.
Okay. A very brief introduction. I grew up in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, one of the most ignorant, isolated people imaginable. Had my life ripped open through a number of experiences, largely at the college level. I spent a semester in inner city Chicago that was really mind-blowing, and then ended up traveling and studying through a program that the University College had that brought me to India, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Japan. And I actually arrived in Israel, Palestine a few days after what was known as the Munich Massacre, related to the killing of the athletes from Israel. And it was the first time that I started to think a little bit about a spiral of violence and where do we enter, where do we start the story? Because obviously Israelis and Palestinians at that time and today see those things very differently. Ended up working on hunger and poverty issues for many years, taught school in the inner city Chicago for a little while. Went to Union Theological Seminary and had some great great professors, including a very good friend, Gustavo Gutierrez. This is a name that some of you may be familiar with, and others. And then taught Justice and Peace Studies for 25 years at the University of St. Thomas. Okay, is that good? You can ask me any other question that you might want. Well, I was asked by a couple different groups to kind of do a deep dive into the budget, and that was a couple of weeks ago, and now the dive has gotten deeper. So much going on, and I hope what I can do is to help us understand a little bit about what's happening and why, and what the consequences are likely to be. And it's those consequences we're going to need to be really mindful of, especially as we try to live responsible lives in light of what's coming at us. Okay, so here we go. You've all probably heard a little bit about this new agency created by the Trump administration called the Department of Government Efficiency. And I'd like to point out that's DOGE, which we could pronounce dodgy. And I think you're going to see as I present what's going on, it really is pretty dodgy. So, my first observation is that making dramatic cuts to the federal budget has been a high priority for the Trump administration, even in these last few days. President Trump ordered the freezing of trillions of dollars of federal grants. He had to backtrack on that. Let's applaud, because that is already the first big example that a lot of what is intended may not be able to happen if we're vigilant, right? So that's why I think we need to dig deep and try to understand what's going on. The second observation is that it's not just about cutting budgets, it's about cutting and reshaping government itself. And there's a lot going on there as well. I think the plan is essentially cutting parts of the federal budget, a kind of purging of officials that seem disloyal. And that's behind what they announced yesterday. And the idea is to offer 2 million workers the possibility of a buyout. What they're really doing there is they're trying to facilitate a self-purge. And I was pleased to hear today that a lot of unions and others have come out and say, don't leave, because that's exactly what this is. Now, if the self-purge doesn't work, and it's not going to work entirely, we're going to hear more about changes to government itself in a few minutes here. Well, in light of these things, we need to know a lot more about what's going on with this Department of Government Efficiency, which I will, the rest of the time, try to refer to as DOGE. And if you forget what DOGE means, you can ask me, and then I'll say Department of Government Efficiency. All right, just first some basic background. What Donald Trump and the mega influencers call the deep state is in fact a civil society administrative state that is critical to reasonably smooth functioning of a complex democratic society. So let's not give in to the language of deep state. Let's think about the necessary administration of life in a complex society under a democratic government. Just by way of background, there are about 3 million federal workers, if you include postal workers, which they have about 600,000 people. So we're talking about 3 million people, 2.4 million or so apart from the post office. Now, only about 4,000 federal workers are political appointees. All others are civic workers who carry out functions within agencies and departments based on their expertise rather than their political affiliation. The system by design is to reward skills and to work against corrupting political patronage that imperils democracy. And in fact, if you want to look throughout history at failed autocratic states, almost all of them failed as a result of this shift to making the functional part of administering society, part of a political patronage system. All right, just a few words about a very, very troubling aspect of DOGE, and that's both the process and the intent. Now, apparently the plan is to embed one or two Trump loyalists in almost every federal agency. And they are going to determine and make recommendations on what cuts to make in those agencies and what federal workers should be kept and who should be fired based on a political litmus test of loyalty to the president. Trump's agenda, and we just see that again in that payout plan, the process and likely results are intended to shift governance away from representative democracy, dramatically increase presidential power and corporate influence. So this is really a concrete strategy of undermining democracy in favor of allegiance to one man and the policies that he is interested in pursuing. As President Biden noted in his farewell address, he said, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy. I think that's pretty accurate. Now, part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that bureaucracies are actually pretty critical to the administration of a state. You need professionalism, you need accountability and monitoring, and we probably need some technological upgrades here and there. But those are not what Donald Trump and his administration are interested in. Those are not their goals. President Trump recently, you probably read this a few days ago, removed at least 17 inspector generals. Now, I didn't know all the things that inspector generals do. There are 74 in all in federal government agencies. And their principal responsibilities are to identify fraud, waste, and abuse, and to ensure efficiency. Now, an article in this Minnesota Star Tribune a couple of days ago described these removals, quote, as an unprecedented purge that could clear the way for President Trump to install loyalists. Now, for me, one of the most chilling messages of these first few days of the Trump presidency has been the encouragement of lawlessness and the disregard of the rule of law. We've seen many examples of this, the pardoning of the insurrectionists, the vengeful removal of security for people like Anthony Fauci and some others, the dismissal of these inspector general without Congress actually passed a law a few years ago that says you cannot get rid of an inspector general until the White House gives 30 days notice to Congress and that they have to provide substantive reasons for why. So I think actually in some ways what a lot of what the Trump presidency so far is pushing the boundaries to see how close to a dictatorship they have become and how much power they have within it. So this is another example of that. Now, here's some of the promises and motivation as we talk about this new DOGE, the creation of this new enterprise. They've talked about promoting major cuts, and it's all over the map. Cuts in federal spending. They've talked about $500 billion, $1 trillion, $2 trillion. And sometimes they talk about that as per year. Sometimes they talk about it as per decade. It's very unclear. But what is clear is that we're talking about staggering amounts of budget cuts that they want to make. Now, here's something that's really important for us to remember. This Department of Government Efficiency has no power to do anything. All it can do is make recommendations to Congress. That's the good news. The bad news is the recommendations are likely to pass because the Republican Party is no longer a party. It's essentially an arm of one president and one person. All right, but that's still really important. That means that if you just get to a couple of Republicans, we can slow down this rush to authoritarianism and these really destructive budget cuts. Now, I've come up with what I think are 4 possible motivations or justification for making drastic cuts in federal spending. Here they are. 1, you could say, well, it's because we have concern that the national debt will rise without massive cuts to government programs. Okay, that's one possible reason. Second reason would be belief that the federal government shouldn't be funding Department X, Y, or Z. For example, the Department of Education has been talked about. We're going to get rid of that. Third, and I'm going to hammer away at this one in a little bit, belief that massive budget cuts are needed to help offset the costs of equally massive tax breaks for the wealthy. We'll come back to that one. And the fourth one is belief that the federal departments and agencies should fulfill whatever mission they have with far fewer workers. Okay, those are our 4 things. We'll hear about a couple of those, but we probably won't hear about number 3 very much. But we're going to talk quite a bit about number 3. Now, one point I want to make is that whatever the motivation for these cuts, there's going to be enormous obstacles to making massive cuts to the federal budget. And if they're made by this administration, what we're going to see, those cuts are going to hurt common people, including many of them that voted for Donald Trump, much more than they're going to hurt the billionaires that are making the recommendations. Now, to understand what's going on, we have to understand the difference between the discretionary part of the federal budget. This may sound like I'm getting into the weeds, but it's actually really important. There's a difference between the discretionary part of the federal budget and the mandatory part of the federal budget. And it's pretty simple, really, to think about. The discretionary portion of the federal budget, that's the budget that Congress approves every year. The Congress, they have the purse strings. They determine how much we spend on education, how much we spend on defense, how much we spend on transportation, all kinds of things. That's all part of the discretionary budget. Congress every year passes a budget and funds things or refuses to fund. The mandatory part of the federal budget consists of items that simply have to be paid every year. Things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, for simplicity's sake, I also include interest on the debt as part of the mandatory part of spending. It has to be paid. Okay, so just think about, okay, we got a discretionary budget that Congress approves, and we've got a mandatory budget that must be paid. Okay, you with me so far? All right, so let's look at 2023 just as a lens into how this works. The total U.S. budget in 2023 was $6.2 trillion. Okay, $6.2 trillion. The mandatory portion of that budget, including interest, was $4.5 trillion. 6.2 is the whole budget, 4.5 is mandatory, stuff that has to be paid. That leaves $1.7 trillion is the discretionary budget, the budget that Congress actually determines. Now, here's an interesting and kind of depressing point. And that is, well, that's not the whole budget. Where did the other money come from? Well, it turns out that in order to meet that $6.2 trillion budget figure, you had to borrow money. And you know how much the money was borrowed in 2023? It turns out it was $1.7 trillion, an amount equivalent to the whole discretionary budget. And that's because of insufficient collection of taxes and revenues. So, in simple words, in order to meet the budget in 2023, the US added $1.7 trillion to the national debt. Okay, so when you hear about the national debt and it's growing, the dynamic is always the same. The government is taking in not enough resources and it's borrowing to cover the cost. Now, what we really need to understand is that it's virtually impossible to make huge budget cuts in the discretionary budget. And hang in with me. This is why. According to the Office of Management and the Budget in 2023, military spending plus veterans benefits alone totaled more than $1 trillion of the discretionary budget. And if you add Homeland Security to that and Veterans Affairs and funding for policing, so those four items, they took up 62% of the discretionary budget. I'm going to say that again. 62% of the federal budget went to those four items. Now, I'm just going to mention this as one watch out moment, and it's one that I haven't been able to investigate very much, but I suppose we should pay attention to the fact that some of the key appointees that the Trump administration has made have talked about the need to privatize veterans care, and they've talked about the need to not give them nearly as much. They're getting way too much more than they deserve. Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs themselves makes up about 500,000 people that are part of that federal workforce. So it's possible that might be a pool of money that they're looking at to make some of these cuts. And what we need to know is simply if they do that, it's going to hurt veterans a lot and it's going to cost way more money, which will actually aggravate the deficit. Okay, so that's just a flag for you to think about. Now, the Trump administration is promising to increase military spending. It's not going to cut Homeland Security. It might be politically difficult to do what it wants to with the Veterans Affairs, and there's no conversation at all about cutting back on federal funds for policing. So what that means, it leaves us with a really simple question. Well, if military spending's off the table, and these other three bigger items that go into the 62%, and it's difficult to go after the veterans, where the heck is the money going to come from? How are you going to cut trillions of dollars out of the 38% of the discretionary budget that remains? That's about $600 billion. You can't do it. So that means we have to be really vigilant about what's going on and where are these cuts likely to be made. Now, I hope I have your interest. It's like a whodunit. What are they doing? Why? Where? But before I get there, I want to take a little detour, and I want to make a defense for this administrative state. It's actually a good thing. Can it be better? Of course. Could there be more efficiency? Probably. There are things that we can do, but I want to make it very clear how important an administrative state is to a modern society like our own. So I'm going to rattle off 25 agencies of the federal government. They're not quite random, but they're kind of random. And I'm just going to You will have heard of many of them. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Government Accounting Office, Export-Import Bank, Federal Trade Commission, National Archives, Federal Trade, oh, I got Federal Trade Commission twice. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, Department of Labor, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research, National Labor Relations Board, National Transportation Safety Board, Peace Corps, Federal Elections Commission, National Council on Disabilities, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Interagency Council on Homelessness, Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, Occupational Safety and Health Department, Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, National Credit Union Administration, Federal Maritime Commission. All right. Now you got a test on all, I'm expecting you to name all of those at the end here. So let's just imagine, I imagine that I'm guessing that there are really some good people working in all those agencies. And they're obviously doing, I mean, anytime nuclear is in the title, I'm kind of interested in what they're doing, right? Well, if we just eliminated all 25 of the ones I named, you know how much of the discretionary budget would be cut? 1/4%. 1/4%. Now, let's kind of continue to look at a slash and burn approach to federal budget cutbacks. If we eliminated the Departments of Transportation, Department of Education, which we're actually talking about, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, get rid of all foreign aid, get rid of the Department of Commerce, cut environmental protection, cut the State Department, all of those cuts, eliminating all of those things would reduce the discretionary budget. It would make up 17% of the discretionary budget. All right. So my point here is that we have to ask ourselves, where's the real money? Where are they actually likely to go to try to get all these cuts? And what's their intent for the resource? So I want you to keep two things in mind. I'm sorry I'm carrying notes, but this is complicated enough that I want to try to be as clear as possible. So two things I want you to keep in mind. The first is that the primary goal of the Trump administrations, both the last time and this time, is to retain or expand tax breaks for the wealthy. That is absolutely the number one fundamental thing that's at stake here in all that I'm talking about. Now, raising the tax revenue through a fair tax system, including taxing the wealthy, that's off the table. The goal now is to have massive federal budget cuts to at least partially offset massive tax breaks for the rich. Now, what you may or may not know is that President Trump's first term, his major accomplishment, the one thing that he did that he says was a great success, was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was considered his greatest achievement. It involved major tax breaks for the wealthy, and it's set to expire if it's not renewed in 2025. As the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities noted, the tax law was, quote, skewed in favor of the rich, with the top 1% receiving an average tax break of $60,000 a year, and the bottom 60% of taxpayers getting less than $400. Now, according to the Congressional Budget Office, making these laws permanent, the income tax law changes, the state tax changes, would cost the federal government $400 billion a year, beginning in 2027. They noted the law has severely eroded our country's revenue base. And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that if this bill that was passed the first time that's about to expire is maintained, it will add $5 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that what's going on here is an effort to find money to help offset huge amounts of money that are going to be part of the old tax breaks and also new ones that are being proposed. Second thing to keep in mind, President Trump has said, I don't know that I believe him, but he has said that Medicare and Social Security are off the table for cuts. That's a promise that he's made. Many Republican senators and congresspeople haven't made that pledge. But Trump has said, under his watch, they won't cut Medicare and Social Security. The reason for that is actually very simple. The political backlash would be enormous. So you can weaken Social Security by not adequately funding it because you cut off the income threshold at which you contribute to Social Security. You can weaken it by lowering or by raising the retirement age, which is unfair to working class people who tend to die young, like my father, who died of cancer at the age of 59, who paid into Social Security his whole life and didn't get a penny. Right? You can do that, but Trump's calculation is, well, a direct attack on Social Security would probably have a lot of pushback. Now, did anybody catch? I named 3 pretty big items that were part of that mandatory budget. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Exactly. Notice that Medicaid is not off the table. Now, there's 2 reasons why Medicaid is on the table. First, it's a big pot of money. The federal government pays 100% of the cost of Medicaid, other than a cost sharing that states have to actually deliver or administer the program. And in 2000, again, using 2023 as a model, it cost $871 billion. The federal government paid $871 billion to maintain the Medicaid program nationwide. Now, the second reason that it's on the table is because Medicaid serves vulnerable constituencies that have limited political. Medicaid, along with the Children's Health Insurance Program, serves almost 80 million people, most of them low-income individuals, including children, pregnant women, and elders with disabilities, people with disabilities. Republicans are looking to add onerous work requirements to Medicaid, transition it to block grants, impose spending caps, and shift a lot of responsibility to states. If I were in the Minnesota House and Senate or the governor, I would be really, really concerned, because almost all of the policies that are being pursued in Washington are shifting responsibilities to the states without adequate funding. That's the basic playbook that is being played out. All right. Now, it's estimated that these cuts to Medicaid that the Republicans are proposing, that would they would cut in excess of $2 trillion over the next 10 years out of that program. So $2 trillion of savings, quote unquote savings, to go help make up $5 trillion just simply by renewing their tax cuts. It really is pretty much of a direct line from one to another. Now, that one I kind of knew, but in digging a little deeper, this one I wasn't quite as clear on. But another prime target for the spending cuts is the Affordable Care Act. Now, Republicans have literally no health care plans of their own, but they want to change how the Affordable Care Act works. They want to introduce high-risk participant pools and they want to reduce subsidies for public health exchanges in order to discourage enrollment. Yeah, under the previous administration, there were enhanced premium subsidies, and that led millions of more people giving at least access to healthcare. All that could go away because those are going to expire in 2025. So they don't even have to do anything. They don't have to enact a new law. They don't have to do anything. They can just sit on their butts and it will result in major, major cuts to people who need that health care. It's estimated that these changes, if the Republicans do nothing, it'll cost the average premium will go up $700 a year, or 79% for the people who are on the Affordable Care Act to receive their health care because of it. All right. Now, these massive budget cuts, and some of them are going to just be small things, relatively small. But relatively small things can have really big damages. I mean, if you cut the Treasury Department, if you cut the IRS, you know, they're not big items in terms of how much they cost, but the impacts can be great. So, in terms of alternatives and challenges, if all I've told you so far is accurate, it's pretty bad, right? There's a lot on our plate right there. But I think part of the shock and awe of the administration is that that's just a small piece of what's going on. And so other Trump administration policies will be equally problematic. Now, I'm going to rattle this off, and some of you may want to cry, and some of you may want to scream, some of you may want to pray, but some of you may feel like there's an opportunity here. So let me just rattle off some of these things, because what I want to point out is that almost everything at the heart of what the administration says it wants to do and has started doing does not respond in any way to really things that are important to the US people, including, again, a lot of the people who voted for Donald Trump. If they go ahead with massive tariffs, it'll fuel inflation, could ignite trade wars. It could actually hurt many sectors, especially and including agriculture. Mass deportation of undocumented persons will cause enormous human suffering. It'll also fuel inflation, cripple agriculture, decimate senior care centers, and increase housing costs. Soaring inequalities and likely rising federal debt will put further strain on Social Security and Medicare and be used to justify cuts to those programs. Increased military spending will further militarize spending priorities within the discretionary budget. In what universe are we pleased that 62% of the discretionary budget is essentially military related? Undermining climate change initiatives in favor of drill baby drill will result in more costly floods, droughts, hurricanes, sea level rises, and wildfires. Undermining FEMA and shifting that responsibility onto the states will be an enormous catastrophe, because states, I think, are in a position where they can help after the initial response by a national team. But to turn all that over to the states, I can't even hardly imagine how bad the likely consequences would be. Decimating federal agencies and budgets, again, will shift many, many financial obligations and responsibilities onto the states. And we need to be grateful that we live in the state that we do, because at least we're starting with kind of a base floor of public responsibility and service and policies. A lot of states are going to be in worse position. Now, I want to say a few words about the debt, because other than using debt to justify a reason to cut essential programs, debt doesn't seem to come up very much. There's no solutions that are being offered by the present government about the debt. And the debt actually, I think, is a real problem. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, 2 or 3 days ago, released, or maybe a week ago, released their annual report. And this is what it said. They project that over the next 10 years, $23 trillion will be added to the national debt. And that didn't include, they noted, another $5 trillion if the Republicans repass their tax cuts, as I described earlier. That means the projection is to add $28 trillion over the next 10 years to the debt. Now, it's beyond the scope of this talk, but I would like to point out that there are avenues through which we could meet the essential needs of our people, and we could reduce and stabilize the nation's debt. But they likely involve these things: cutting wasteful military spending. Again, the present administration is planning on significantly raising military spending. An improved Medicare for all healthcare system. Much of it, I read part of the Congressional Budget Office report in which they projected that $23 trillion increase over the next 10 years. And two of the major causes of that rise in the debt are the cost of borrowing money because the deficit is soaring so much. And another one was healthcare. If we did healthcare like almost every other industrial nation or developed nation do, we could probably reduce our healthcare costs and increase the quality of the care and the affordability of the care for about half the cost that we do now. And a lot of that deficit that's so ugly wouldn't look quite so bad. And then there are simple ways to fully fund Social Security. It could be done. They're not even talking about it. It's not on the table. And then I'm a big fan of progressive income taxes, but also wealth tax. My wife reminded me, she was actually reading a novel the other day, and it talked about something I had written about years ago, that in the 50s, under a Republican president, the top tax rate on income was 91%. And it was for quite some time. And 91% kicked in at $400,000, which today would be the equivalent of $4 million. Now, if we had a higher tax rate, I know we'll get to 91%, I'd be all for it. We could solve many, many, many of our debt-related problems, but also we wouldn't have to go through this song and dance about why we need to cut all these essential social programs to feed the wealth of the already incredibly wealthy. It's very, very disturbing. All right, I want to introduce you to a new word. It's a word I learned. It was in an editorial. It was mentioned in a Minnesota Star Tribune editorial a while ago. Caucusocracy. Have any of you heard of this term? A few of you. Caucusocracy is defined by the American Heritage Dictionary as a government by the least qualified or most unprincipled citizens, or government by the worst men, or government under the control of the nation's worst or least qualified citizens. Well, I would say that's pretty much of a perfect description of where we are.
Spell it.
With a K, here. A-K-I-S T-O-C-R-A-C-Y. K-A-K-I-S-T-O, Kracy, A-R-A-C-Y. It's a very helpful definition. I read a quote the other day by, turns out, know nothing about the man, Ivo Daldler, other than he's chief officer for the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. And he wrote that his major concern, which is a concern I share, he says, is not that liberalism has lost an ability to offer solutions, but that populism's failure will lead to repressive consequences by the very strong men who rode the populist wave to power. I'll repeat it and then I'll summarize what I think it means. He says, it's not that liberalism has lost an ability to offer solutions. That's not the problem. The problem is that populism's failure will lead to repressive consequences by the very strong men who rode the populist wave to power. In other words, a grave danger is that as things unravel, and I expect we're going to see a lot of evidence of unraveling over the next 4 years. The danger is that as things unravel, the architects of the unraveling will blame others for their failure and exploit them to further enhance their own power, which is part of this. It's almost an insurance policy for a failed autocracy, is that even as you fail, you can turn your failure into blaming others and thereby increase your own power. Now, I'm going to close with an idea, but as I do that, I want to stress two thoughts via quotes from Albert Camus' book, The Plague. So I'll probably need to read this one again. He says, here but again and again, there comes a time in history when the person who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 is punished with death. The school teacher is aware of this. And the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation. The question is one of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. Okay, I'll read that one more time. Probably it's confusing the second time as the first. And then I'll give you my take. He says, here but again and again, there comes a time in history when the person who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 is punished with death. The school teacher is aware of this. And the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation. The question is one of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. So here's what I think is relevant about that quote. For years, we have seen Republican officials and many other powerful people in this country knowingly make political calculations to accommodate and enable rather than work to stop the rise of a man they knew to be an authoritarian con man. And they have sold their souls and are in so deep that they no longer know that 2 + 2 = 4. They certainly won't say it, but I think now they're in so deep, they don't know that 2 + 2 is. So I'm throwing out a suggestion that I wish someone who is a much better organizer than I am would take on. But I think it might be time to start a new movement to counter the MAGA movement. And I would call it the 2 + 2 = 4 movement. And 2 + 2 = 4 would simply be a simple code that everyone on our hats, sweatshirts, anywhere you went, it would essentially mean cut the bullshit. And you'd put them on, there'd be all kinds of opportunities. When President Trump and Republican senators and congresspersons appoint some of the least qualified people imaginable, we would put out huge signs. 2 + 2 = when you went into grocery stores and you had it said 2 + 2 = 4, people are going to say, well, what does that mean? 2 + 2 = 4. And you could say it means cut the bullshit. And it's in related. When Pete Hegseth becomes defense secretary and Robert Kennedy Jr. is chosen to head the Department of Health and Human Services, we should create a national outcome. 2 + 2 = 4. When they claim the tax cuts to the wealthy pay for themselves, it's another 2 + 2. When they threaten Canada, Mexico, or Greenland militarily, it's another time to be clear. 2 + 2 = 4. The same holds when the President of the United States and a willing Republican Senate and Congress turn the FBI and Justice Department into instruments of vengeance against political foes. Or when they cut the IRS and give billions of dollars of tax break to billionaires and stay with it and say with a straight face, they're really worried about the deficit. 2 + 2, another 2 + 2 moment. Or when they say they care about inflation and the cost of eggs while pursuing inflationary policies and those that will throw farmers under the bus. Now another quote from Camus. He says, I have no idea what's awaiting me for us, or what will happen when this all ends. For the moment, I know this, there are sick people and they need curing. Or I might say instead, there are sick people running our government, and many of them are so far off the edge in their support of a dangerous con man that they no longer know that 2 + 2 = 4. They must be stopped. Or, I don't know what exactly awaits us or what will happen when this all ends. For the moment, I know this. There are and will be many hurting people who need our support and protection, our vision and practical ideas for real solutions to real problems, and our determination to build a fairer, more just, more sustainable nation. So the challenge for us now, it seems to me, and this is my personal challenge too, is we've got to have our ears to the ground. It's still very early on the one hand to know exactly how all this is going to unfold. What we can say, unfortunately, with a great deal of certitude, is it's not going to be pretty. And we've seen that already. And I know that there are communities that are united to try to stand up to ICE. I've taken some hope from the fact that many police have said, we're not going to help ICE. That's not our job description. It's not what we do. So there's going to be, I would say, dozens and dozens of opportunities for us to be in solidarity, in relationship. And I think one of the spaces, I don't know how I get into them, just to be listening. But I think one of the groups that voted for Trump in huge numbers that are going to be hurt the most are agricultural people, dairy farmers, other farmers. Anyway, in all the things that start to go poorly, there is a hope that out of the ashes of that, we can build relationships with those who are most effective and begin moving in a more movement direction in favor of the kind of society that we want to live in. And I can think of no better group of people than people of faith to be present in the way I'm talking about, to have our ears to the ground, to have our hands and feet ready, and to just do what we can as things unfold. Thank you.
Okay, so Jack has agreed. We'll spend a little time in conversation. Sam's got a microphone. I've got a microphone as well. Comment, thought, reaction to Jack's talk. We'll start there. We've got a hand in the back here, and then I'll do the second one over here.
Looking at the policies that are being promoted, they are against the teachings of Catholic Church, Lutheran Church, Methodist Church. So I would argue that we have to put the leadership of these churches that have contact with so many people, have to put them on notice that we expect them to speak out against the horrible policies that are being promoted that are hurting the least of our brethren, which is, something that is being taught that bias towards the poor.
I agree entirely, and I think again, what I would say for each of us, and I include myself right in the midst of this, I'm trying to think of where do I have a voice? Where do I have a connection? What tradition am I a part of? What groups am I a part of? And obviously, you just named one that the church hierarchy or people in influential positions, they need to hear from us. So let's think, even include that, and then think beyond that as well. Where has your life intersected with institutions and groups of people, whether it be the church or in other ways? Those are people that need to hear from us. Thanks, Jim.
To whom do we owe the debt? The national debt?
It's owned by people throughout the world. Yeah, I mean, some of it is owned by people in the United States. A lot of it is owned by investors outside. Yeah, it's always bothered me that the United States has been powerful enough. I'm going to not mince my words here. Powerful enough to do horrible things to people around the world that we have never been held accountable. And we've been powerful enough, strong enough that we have not had to pay the consequences of our actions. And that is Trump's main military approach is going to be to threaten people with our power and get them to do what Colombia did, was to back down on something that they wanted to do. So yes, we owe money to lots of people, lots of nations all around the world, and not all debt is bad debt, but if we have $23 trillion to our debt over the next decade, we're going to be spending way more money on interest on debts than we are our entire discretionary budget for the things that really matter. So, yeah, there's some vulnerability in that debt. I think you're right in pointing in that direction.
We'll take
To pick up where this subject,
go ahead.
to pick up where the gentleman started off with, someone like yourself, there needs to be a script written. And I think through the bishops, through all the hierarchy in this whole country, have something to go off of, to start using this into their homilies, so that the people know that we are here because of Jesus, who was concerned about the common good, and he went to the cross to die because of that. And I think that's where we've really been, I don't mean to be negative, but to say where we really have neglected the source. Because what has Christianity done as getting the people together with the same goals of what do we need to do and haven't done well enough in the past to be concerned about the common good. Thank you.
Yeah, just one very quick comment, and that is that I think probably most of the people in this room would agree with me when I say we now see the absolute worst in religion.
Mhm.
And there still is the possibility, and we do see some of the best among religious people. And it's up to us to be magnifying those voices that you're talking about. Thank you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What about the corporations? And I think Target is the perfect example.
Yeah.
That they caved in, and somehow we need to have a massive boycott. The people need to write and tell them that they caved in. They
Sell
didn't.
out the values you've had your whole life in order to be given power
How we
by
go about doing that. But I
Kennedy,
think
who ran for president as a Democrat and an independent, lashing out at his former party.
They used to be my friends.
Other
Now they're against me because anything that President Trump does, any decision he makes, has to be
It's very disappointing
lampooned.
to see how many corporations and big companies have just caved. And I guess that shouldn't be too big of a surprise on the one hand. Uh, and again, it's another one of those layers of failure to hold accountable, and it goes on and on and on, and then it gets worse instead of better. So the one that someone said to me, we're talking, my community is talking about a boycott of Target as well, and I think a lot of other people. I think it's really important to publicly send them the information that this is very, very disturbing, and we want them to do something different. What this person pointed out to me is we may need to be a little bit careful that we should probably be talking to workers at Target as well, because we don't want the impact to be that this is something that those of us who are outraged are doing in ways that may not be supported within by some of the workers themselves. I think we have to be careful.
Well, I tell you,
Go.
oh,
And then I'll
Okay. Go.
I was just gonna say, also about religion, sometimes it gets in the way because we're not all of one faith. But anyway, Trump is one person. And I appreciated your whole talk. 2 + 2. It's simple. I loved it. Thank you.
all right.
Thank you.
Spread that.
My concern about, you're talking about the budget part, if enough of the refugees and folks that he wants to throw out of the country, they're like billions in tax money because they all pay their share of taxes. What could that possibly do?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, and I have lots of figures that live in my head, and this one may not be entirely accurate, but it's very close. I think it's somewhere around $23 billion or $28 billion a year that undocumented workers put into the Social Security system, for example. So that's one practical example of what you're talking about. There's so many examples we can give about this administration shooting themselves in the foot, but doing it, they shoot themselves in the foot, but then they're pulverizing the population, not shooting in the feet. I mean, they're hurting lots of people, but they're also undermining programs that are just so critical. Of course, one could make the argument, and I would say that even though Trump has said cutting Social Security is off the table, there are many, many Republicans who want to undo Social Security.
We got a question here, then one in the back, and I think another in the.
Someone mentioned the big corporations. The big corporations, which we haven't talked about too much. And one definition of fascism is when the big corporations control the leaders and the elected officials in government. Yeah. And that's what they did, of course, in Germany. And I think we need to be more aggressive with our elected leaders. Some of you have heard of move to amend to just simply try to get the big money out of politics. We have 2 of our leaders who have supported it. I started working on this many years ago, and the others have not. And I think you know who the 2 are who have signed on. They're very close to us, and the others have not. Yeah.
No, it definitely would be very beneficial to try to get money,
and of course,
make money out of
citizens, and then the Supreme Court. Citizens United decision was a big part of that. That funneled more corporate money to the big corporations, and of course, the 2017 tax cuts were devastating. Those 2 things were what our church worked on hard and got congregation support. So
yeah, no, I agree. Getting money out of politics is critical, but also quite difficult because both parties have learned to live within the framework of that system. Is there someone back here? Yeah.
Yeah, where do you find hope in this current situation?
You know, I find hope in a variety of places. One, I pointed out earlier that already they've made Trump at least back down on one thing. That's good. I think that contradictions lead to openings. And I think a lot of the contradictions in the policies that I named, again, I think the majority of people in the United States would rather have a healthcare system that's affordable than one that isn't. I think the vast majority of people in the United States would prefer to have a farming population that is fairly diverse and isn't completely dominated by corporations. I think most people would prefer to have clean water. My point is that there are a lot of things that get in the way of us talking to each other, but there are a lot of possibilities that are going to emerge in the context of the non-solutions and the problem making that is going to flow from a lot of the policies that are coming at us. Now, it's not hopeful that those bad things are coming at us. What's hopeful is that it creates an opportunity for us to broaden our coalitions, to broaden our relationships, to be in solidarity with others, and to have a voice that lays out a more positive vision for what the country could be, can be, if we work together. Those are some of the things. I play tennis with a senior tennis league, and I was talking to an 88-year-old man who's playing tennis still. He's a great role model. And he was saying, yeah, it's really, really bad what's going on, but this is going to prompt a major pushback. And I said, well, you're right, and I hope that we can all be part of it. So that's what I would say.
One place that I've placed a lot of hope in is Meister Eckhart said that breakdown is breakthrough.
Breakdown is breakthrough. That's good.
Yeah, and so
He also said, don't walk sightless among miracles.
yeah.
Like that one. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, back there. There's one here. Yeah.
What are the prospects in your mind of Trump losing control of Congress in 2026?
I think there's a decent chance. In fact, I read something the other day, back to your point about money, because the other thing that money does is it gerrymanders. That just North Carolina alone, the gerrymandering there costs the Democrats the House in this election. So, I heard the other day, I think that Trump actually got 23% of the voting population in the country, and he's claiming a mandate. 23% isn't much of a mandate. So I think the prospects are actually decent. Now, that doesn't mean it's really, really important. I haven't quite figured out if Trump is the puppet or the puppeteer. And I think there's some of both going on, and kind of this gentleman's point about the corporations. You could not come up with a more oligarchic plan and put it more visible than the Department of Government Efficiency, which is going to be not staff, they're going to volunteer, but position themselves within every government agency, and they're billionaires and loyalists. Now, another reason to be a little bit hopeful is the MAGA coalition is MAGA itself is you've got a core that is at this point unmovable. But within that coalition, you have Steve Bannon calling Elon Musk a effing idiot, right? So any contradiction like that within this movement, and the movement is filled with many of them, means it's kind of prone. But again, Trump on the one, I don't think there could be MAGA without Trump. And I don't think I think this is going to sound really ironic, but for those of us who want deep change, there may be no greater ally than Trump can't help but being Trump. And the interesting thing now, though, is to answer my own question. There's a lot of puppeteering going on by corporations influencing Trump, but that can't penetrate the narcissism. And so there's going to be enormous conflict there. And again, it's a bizarre reason perhaps, but it's another reason for hope.
So we got one more question in the back. We'll do one in the front and then we'll give you
And
some.
then I'll stick around if anybody wants to chat.
Yes, we seem to be moving into an oligarchy. To what extent might that include a dictatorship?
I don't know if anybody saw that. We could probably dig it up, but I wrote an op-ed piece months ago before the election. And I think I called it authoritarianism can happen here, or can it? And I would say that as disturbing as these policy things are, the budget cuts that are being proposed are, equally or even more concerning is this conscious building of an edifice of authoritarianism. And we talked a lot about the influence of money and how important that is to a lot of the actors that are shaping policy. But I think for Donald Trump, control is as or more important. And I think for the oligarchs themselves, it's not a coincidence that these oligarchs are a lot of them tech companies that control what we read and how we think. There's so many things that are going on, and I touched on some of them that confirm what you just said, that there is a very, very real, in my view, and deep concern that we need to have about the intentional dismantling of democratic systems in our country. And once that ball starts rolling, and it's rolling, and I hope that maybe there's been a little bit of an overstep this first week. If I have to hear one more person say, "Well, I didn't know he was going to do that," right? Well, we're going to be hearing a lot of that. Anyway, okay.
One last question here.
First, thank you. And I had one comment and then one question. So the comment is in regards to the division and chaos that exists as a result of Trump's actions. Splinters the leadership for reaction. There's so many ways that one could tackle on so many perspectives.
So many things going on.
It's hard to unify. So how do you work toward that? That's sort of a reflection. But the comment is simply because it didn't get mentioned, but it's there. The background actors of the country's leaderships who also are authoritarian. Do you want to ever elaborate on any of that?
Well, I think Trump he certainly has the same kind of controlling dictatorial impulses as Putin does, for example. I mean, and this is, I have a famous brother-in-law psychologist who wrote a book about Donald Trump. And in essence, one of the things that it said was, there probably has never been in history a narcissist as deeply narcissistic as Donald Trump. And I think that there is a relationship between that and this fascination with autocracy. And I think that's a legitimate thing to think about.
Well, why don't we give Jack a big thanks for him coming today? Along the line, I think there are many notebooks and pages filled with thoughts and questions. You've given us a lot to think about.
If anybody is interested, if there's somebody here that I could, I had a lot of notes. I would be happy. I'm going to be transcribing that in what would be a little bit more readable. If anybody wants that, I am happy to share it. I just don't want to get 50 different emails and have to do that. So if there's somebody, Kathleen, I will get a summation or a clear, yeah.
We can
I'll
have
get
a,
that ready and I'll give it to Kathleen and if you're interested.
and we can have a sheet on the table, maybe Samantha, you could just put emails and we'll have people sign up there if they're interested. So just a couple of follow-up things to Jack's talk about hope, about there are plenty of opportunities. We need to remain vigilant. I've been getting questions every single day about what can we do. There is one simple, practical thing you might be interested. Catholic Relief Services called last night. If you're not aware, one of the executive orders was to do an immediate halt to all federal aid that goes to assistance programs overseas. So immediately, all programs are being reviewed and the funding stops immediately until the review process is over with, which could take until April or May. So programs that feed the hungry, clinics, HIV programs, water projects, think of any Catholic relief program going on overseas. Congress has already budgeted, allocated that money. They can say, like they've done with every other presidential administration during times of transition, the funding continues during the review process when decisions are being made. I don't know the exact dollar amount of that halt in funding, but it's minuscule when you think about it in terms of the federal budget. So we have a letter to Congresswoman Betty McCollum on the table there. Betty McCollum is on the Congressional House Appropriations Budget Committee. Very appropriate person. Strongly encourage you, don't just sign your name and address on the letter, add a comment why you think our federal government should continue putting money to these programs. If you're searching for a word or phrase, there's another sheet there on the table with some simple sentences you might consider, but craft something to make it personal. Drop it in the box and we'll mail it for you, or even better yet, go home and call her office and leave a message, send her an email. She needs to hear that there are people of goodwill who think of the common good beyond our borders. And so again, one practical thing you can think about doing. Secondly, students at St. Kate's just went on a trip to the border. They are doing an art exhibit, photo exhibit of their trip starting on Monday. They're having a reception on Thursday the 6th at noon over at St. Kate's at the library. There are flyers and little quarter sheets over there if you've got any questions. Hint, my intern Sam was very involved in this trip and the project, so you can ask her any questions as well, but she would love for people to come to the opening reception on the 6th, but engage the students. They have been transformed and their eyes have been opened through this simple border trip. And then lastly, Jack asked that we were going to give him a stipend, and he asked that we make a donation instead to the peacemakers, the people create peacemakers. So a check is in the mail to them for him coming here. We just wanted to thank him, and we hope he might return in a month or two to keep us vigilant and hopeful. With that, Jack said he would stick around, but again, sign a letter if you are willing, or take some home, make a phone call, send an email, do whatever you can. There are things we can still do. And thank you all for coming, and those in line as well.
Say, good to meet you.
Right.